Alrighty, I am talking to Ken Coach, and a disclaimer off the top, Ken and I have worked together for many, many years. We teach courses together, but when it comes to the field of crisis communications, I defer to Ken's expertise. And so what we really want to talk about today is how has this current environment, whether it's COVID related or technology related, how has it changed the practice of helping clients in crisis? So Ken, first of all, give me like a really quick capture of your background in terms of being a crisis communications expert.
Yeah, Joanne, it's nice to be with you. And I started out as you did. When we were infants, we worked in television and were reporters and anchors, and which I think is a great basis. And it gives us that background of knowing how reporters think and knowing where a story can go and what's a good story and what's not so good a story and what to do about it. But many more years ago than I like to admit, I left as those friends that you and I have who are still in the media, you and I both went to the dark side and we started working for public relations and doing things like that. And over those years, I have built up some expertise with some very, very high profile clients, most of which I can't talk about because we work with NDAs and that sort of stuff. But I've worked with clients that have had front page news around the world, and it wasn't pretty. It was sort of some bad things that they had to deal with. In that time, you start to, my role has always been to try to anticipate where the media would go with the story and how to mitigate any negativity that could come out of that. And I developed a sort of a sense of the three things that the public is expecting to hear when something has gone wrong. And they are, I fixed it, I'm sorry, and it's never going to happen again. Now, to the extent that they can say that, the crisis can go down. Obviously, lawyers get involved, and sometimes you can't say that, but you may not be able to say, I'm sorry, but you need to be able to take responsibility, even if you didn't do it. If there was someone within your organization, somebody needs to step up and take responsibility. You need to be seen to have taken steps to mitigate or fix or solve whatever the problem was. And then you also need to be seen to be taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. Now, realistically, no one can say it will never happen again, but the public demands that you do something to show that it's unlikely to happen again. That's the short kind of rundown of the things that we do when we're called in. And of course, whenever we're called in a situation like that, people are panicking. And we've got to really, part of it is letting them know what could happen and letting them know how we can mitigate damage.
So what's changed? Because my sense of working with clients, not in crisis, but just working with clients, is that the communications landscape has changed. The public's expectations have changed, and maybe even the way we anticipate what media is going to do with a story has maybe changed as well. So what are you seeing that's evolved?
Joanna, you're right. But so a couple of things started to change even before the pandemic. And then the pandemic has caused even more changes than that. One of the things that I started to see before the pandemic hit was that in addition to those three things I mentioned, that people were starting to believe that if you've done something wrong, you should also be punished. And so it wasn't enough just to fix the problem anymore. There was a kind of a sense of there should be consequences in some way or another to you. So that has intensified during the pandemic because, everybody who's just going about their business and not seeing their relatives at Christmas and working from home believes that they have consequences that are not because of them doing anything wrong. So if they see somebody step out of line, they really expect there to be consequences in some major kind of a way in that regard. So that's something that I've noticed. And I've also noticed that some indiscretions that might have been forgiven before the pandemic are not anymore now. So a good example was over the Christmas holidays. I think in many countries, I know it happened in Britain and it happened in the United States, and certainly several situations here in Canada where politicians who were saying, stay home, don't get in with people, don't isolate yourself. And they went to a Mexican vacation or they did something. Well, the outrage that flowed from that was quite strong. And it wasn't enough for them to say, I shouldn't have done it. That wasn't acceptable. So that apology didn't go over very well. We saw in some cases, if it was a cabinet minister, they had to step down from their post, or there might be some other sort of situations where they needed to be published. What I found really interesting about that, there were a few excuses that I think in non-pandemic times would have been okay. A couple of situations where someone had an ailing grandmother and they went to see them and try to help them. And we'd say, well, of course, that's a good reason. But I think a lot of people stuck at home with ailing parents or grandmothers in long-term care facilities that they can't go see are saying, well, if I can't see my grandfather, why should you travel to Greece to see your grandmother in that regard? So the tolerance is not as high because of the situation, I think, that everybody's trying to live through.
It's interesting. I came across a comment some months ago, actually probably before the pandemic, talking about how technology has actually taken us back to the village where we look to our fellow villagers to tell us who makes the best bread and what time should you be at the butcher to get the best lamb chops, that sort of thing. But in a way, as you describe that, what it makes me think of is the old punishment where you got locked in the stocks in the town square and people could walk by and throw garbage at you. And that now seems to be the prerequisite, right, for how we want to see people treated who have transgressed in some way.
Well, sure, and the locks in the town square are probably Twitter these days, because that's where we see things explode, and there's always that kind of reaction to things. The other really interesting thing about Twitter, as an example of one form of social media, is that virtually all journalists are on it. So I actually follow about 800 different journalists on Twitter, and I'm noticing a change in their responses to stories as well as the public's responses. So they're, reporters are people like everyone else. So, but they have the same intolerance to certain things that they would have tolerated more or thought was not a story beforehand, that nowadays, and we know this because they chatter about it. And there's a certain amount of outrage that they'll talk to each other on Twitter about and say, oh my God, what's wrong with these people? And then you get the extremist of go ahead, have your Mexican vacation and kill my grandfather and that sort of stuff. So that's strong. I mean, there's evidence that having those vacations spreads it, but there's no evidence that it goes directly to your grandfather. But the sentiment is that high. And the journalists are feeling that as well as people who are not journalists.
Do you feel that personal expression of outrage or whatever it happens to be that journalists are expressing personally on Twitter, do you feel that that's bleeding into the way they cover stories? For example, a story about an organization in crisis?
I do. And it's way different from when you and I were reporting things. And I'm sure you had the same experience that I had, where I had editors who could tell if my personal opinions were sneaking into the story, and they would hammer me the next day for it. I remember my very first CBC editor called me into his office after I'd run something, and he said, so I saw your interview with that guy. And I said, yeah. He said, you really liked him, didn't you? I said, I thought he was okay. And he said, well, you think he's doing good work? I said, I do think he's doing good work. And they said, well, if you believe that, then ask him the tougher questions. Because if he can answer those tough questions, he'll look better than the softballs you were throwing at him. And I got chewed out as a result of it. Nowadays, there's something that I'm starting to call heroes and villains journalism that happens. And I see this on all the talk radio stations that have interviews. I see it almost every day. Near the beginning I'll give you an example, which was near the beginning of the pandemic. I won't name any names, but a local radio host, within the space of a half an hour, did 2 interviews. And the first interview was with someone who was saying that they needed more money, and because of the pandemic, they weren't able to do the services that they used to do. And the questions were like, well, how awful is it for you? And why won't the government give you more money and to keep up the very good work that you're doing? Interestingly, that same host, 30 minutes later, was interviewing someone from the government. And one of the first questions was, aren't you being irresponsible by spending money like you're a drunken sailor? You're throwing it off the back of the truck. When will the spending stop? How are we going to be able to afford all the spending that you're doing? And I gave my head a shake and I said, well, wait a minute. But what happened was the person doing the good work was cast as a hero before the interview started. The politician, almost by nature, was cast as a villain. So when we do crisis communications work, one of the first things I do sometimes is identify whether my client is going to be in the hero or the villain category, and what we can do to do about that. And,
right.
And sometimes
we used to call it David and Goliath as well, right?
Yes.
Little guy versus the big guy. And so you had to, if you were the big guy, you had to find a bigger guy to be the Goliath so you could still be David.
That's right. That's right. Or be seen to be doing some great noble act, which is the other kind of thing that comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
So at the risk of being self-serving, I think I want to talk about why people should get some advice if they're in a crisis. And I think you've laid the groundwork by saying it is so complex now. The landscape is so complex. The pitfalls are everywhere. You have to step so gingerly. So there's a good reason to get some expert advice on this. But I think you've got some thoughts that are even beyond that. So maybe give me your pitch for that. Why people need you?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that that happen. I've covered hundreds of different crises as a professional in helping people out. And when it happens, and actually, to be honest with you, it's happened to me. I've been in a sort of situation where I had someone kind of unjustly attacking me. In that moment, the adrenaline runs, and it's hard to think clearly. You're right in a defensive mode. So one of the reasons to bring in a professional is for someone to do an objective look at how serious is the crisis, and what should we do about it. And in many cases, when I step in and they tell me what the details are, I might say, oh, it's worse than you thought, because you're not thinking there's this and this, and there's a couple of other reactions that could happen. But it has also happened, and it's happened to me fairly recently, where I looked at it and I said, you know what? This is not that big a deal. If we do a couple of things, you can present your point of view, people will understand what you've done, and it will die down. So it's that objective third party look at it, which I think is very, very important. And the other thing that's important, it used to be that when there was a crisis, what major clients would do is just run to their lawyers. And there's a problem with that, because the lawyers will help you win an inevitable court case, but you could very well lose the court of public opinion. Mm-hmm. And more organizations have realized that now, that we might win a court case when we're bankrupt, because no one will buy our product anymore because they don't believe in us. Because a lot of it is trust that you have. So it's as important to handle any legal issues as it is to handle any public relations or public perception issues that come up.
It is always a pleasure to chat about what's going on around us, Ken. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm always delighted to chat with you and hear your thoughts on what's going on in the world at large. So I wish you well, and I hope that everybody that needs you will find you.
Joanna, thank you for this opportunity. And likewise, you and I used to work together a lot. And if I don't see you for a while, I miss your sage advice. So thank you.
Well, maybe we will find a way to work together in the future, because everything is brand new right now. So let's come up with something clever to do.
Great idea.
Thanks, Ken.
Bye-bye.